I'm Claire Hubble, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Russia announces its retreat from Kherson city, we discuss the implications of what some are calling the most significant moment in the war since the Ukraine counteroffensive began. But is this really the triumph it appears, a damning defeat for Russian forces? Or is there more to it than meets the eye?
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 10th of November, day 260. And today I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, and the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent in Ukraine, Joe Barnes. I started by asking Roland for details of Putin's latest retreat in Kherson.
Yeah, right. So I think it took a lot of us by surprise. So yesterday afternoon, probably kind of early evening Moscow time, there was a televised briefing in which General Sergei Surovkin, that's the commander-in-chief of Russia's forces in Ukraine, briefed Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and he basically said to Shoigu, look, I've assessed the situation from all angles, and the reality is the best thing for us to do is to withdraw from Kherson, the part of Kherson region on the right bank that's the west bank of the Dnipro River, and happens to include the city of Kherson, the regional capital, although he didn't mention that, to withdraw our troops from there, just give it up, use the Dnipro, which is the major geographic barrier in Ukraine, as a defensive line, and his justification for that was, look, the logistics aren't working, it's not what we want to do, we're not going to win by retreating, but on the other hand, this is the way we're going to save lives, and we're going to preserve the combat capability of the army. Sergei Shoigu said, I agree with your analysis and conclusions, and told him to do it with all speed, and to preserve the lives of both soldiers and interestingly, Shoigu told him to make a point of letting those civilians who want to leave, those civilians who perhaps collaborated with the Russians, are able to get out as well. So a major kind of development, because we've known the Russians have been in trouble in Kherson for a long time. They've been putting up a pretty bullish defense in the face of the big Ukrainian push down there. They haven't made it easy for the Ukrainians, but they've been losing ground. And the reality was really pretty much as Sergei Surovkin told Mr. Shoigu, which is that it was in the long term an untenable position. So hugely significant politically, because it is I'm losing count. Is it the fourth major defeat for the Russians? I mean, that they retreated from Kiev when they realized they couldn't take that. They were driven back from Kharkiv. Then they collapsed in Kharkiv. So this is something like the third major kind of operational level setback for the Russians since this war began. There's absolutely no way of spinning it in any other way, and Russian state TV isn't trying to spin it in that way. So the messaging is quite tightly controlled. The Russian state TV propagandists, the usual kind of characters, Mr. Sobolev on his TV show talking about a difficult decision, but you've got to be brave to make those kinds of decisions. No one wants to make it, but well done for the general for making the difficult but correct choice. And interestingly, the real loudmouths at the top of the Russian pyramid, people like Ramzan Kadyrov and Yevgeny Prigozhin, who respectfully run. Kadyrov's got his own basically private army of Chechen fighters, and Prigozhin runs Wagner. They've been very vocally critical of the defense ministry at some points in this conflict, but they are reading from the same hymn sheet. They've clearly been told, come on, get on message. And I'll just read you what it said. Prigozhin, I don't have the quote exactly to hand, but basically the same thing. This is the correct decision. It's difficult. and so on. So that's the message from the Russians. The other significant thing, of course, although not entirely surprising, is that there was no sign of Vladimir Putin during this. This was set up in the manner of a Vladimir Putin televised meeting with his officials. There's Minister Shoigu at his briefing table. An official comes in, briefs him, and the big boss says, granted, yeah, okay, let's do as you suggest. This is a routine thing on Russian television, but it usually shows Putin telling officials to do good or positive things. And it's very transparent how Shoigu and Surovkin have been made to carry the can for what is clearly a defeat. Now, that said, have they actually retreated yet? The Ukrainians are being very cautious. They're saying that they've seen no sign that the Russians are going to quit Kherson without a fight. That said, Valery Zaluzhny, the chief Ukrainian general, did say that the Ukrainians have retaken 12 settlements in the past 24 hours. He wouldn't say earlier today. He refused to confirm, basically, when asked whether or not he can see signs of the Russians actually leaving. It's going to be a difficult and drawn-out operation if the Russians are going to live up to their word to do that. But significantly, we do have kind of photo confirmation of Ukrainian troops inside a village called Snihurivka, which is about just under 30 miles straight north from Kherson. That has been a linchpin in the Russian defensive line. It's been very intensively fought over for the past few weeks. Ukrainians are now in there, so there's definite signs of progress.
Thank you for that, Roland. Coming to you next, Joe, what has the Ukrainian response been, particularly that of President Zelensky?
Hi, folks. Yeah, we've raced down to Kryvyi Rih, which is kind of used as a staging post for Western journalists to get into the Kherson region this morning in kind of response to the news. But so the Ukrainian reaction has been rather muted. It's been not one of excitement, but one of kind of hesitation and not wanting to not accelerate any sort of push into Kherson. So in his overnight address last night, President Zelensky, he urged caution, and he basically maintained the operational secrecy, the kind of fog of war that Roland often talks about when he's on the podcast over what Ukraine is doing in the south. So he said, and I quote him, "We move very carefully, without emotions and unnecessary risks, in the interests of the liberation of our entire land, and so that there are as few losses as possible." So when I was in Kryvyi Rih last, a few weeks ago, we met a field surgeon, a military field surgeon. And this chap was basically saying that during the heaviest days of fighting, that there are around 250 to 300 Ukrainian soldiers being taken back into Kryvyi Rih, which kind of sits at the rear of the southern counteroffensive. And that basically, during those really intense days, that means more soldiers are wounded as they're basically kind of pushing forward as fast as possible. So this is Ukraine not kind of saying, let's really go gung-ho, let's preserve what we've got, let's make sure that we're not kind of making any rash decisions in response to what the Russians have said. And there's also still quite a degree of reluctance to almost believe the Russians. There's always kind of a mantra of, we'll see it, we'll believe it when we actually see it. And so Mikhailo Podolak, he's one of the key advisors to the Ukrainian president. He last night said, as Roland mentioned earlier, there's no signs of Russian forces leaving Kherson and leaving the city yet. And he said, actions speak louder than words. We see no signs that Russia is leaving without a fight. So it's really that, is they are not trying to create a level of excitement. They're not treating it as a major victory yet. They are continuing on their own plan counteroffensive, and they won't let Russia dictate the terms by withdrawing and potentially creating something in terms of a dangerous situation for their troops. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Joe. And away from the military, I wonder, have you had a chance to speak to any civilians on the ground, and what has their response been like to this news?
So I have, but I won't give too much away, because I would urge you to read tomorrow's newspaper, because myself and a few others on the Telegraph's foreign desk are currently working on a dispatch about the story of how it unfolded on the ground and how civilians reacted, how what the Russian military did in essentially what was a kind of a last days of Rome sort of atmosphere in Kherson yesterday and this morning, and going in today as the news kind of plays out and as the fighting essentially moved closer to the city. And so kind of in the last minutes we've seen, and please someone excuse my pronunciation of this, but Kiskalevka, a city just about 15 kilometers northwest of Kherson, they have we've seen kind of images of Ukrainian soldiers there, so they are kind of getting close, but how close, again, because of this kind of fog of war and because of this operational secrecy, we really don't know where the Ukrainians and how far they've got. So it could be kind of days before we actually see some major kind of operation in and around Kherson itself.
Thank you for that, Joe. Francis, I have a question for you next. Given that Moscow only orchestrated a sham referendum in September in order to make Kherson become part of Russia, how humiliating is this defeat, and will Putin recognise it as such?
Thanks, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. I think that's a really important point to emphasise here. I mean, this is very much a strategic defeat, but I think it really should be underlined the symbolic nature of this defeat as well. As you say, it was only a matter of months ago that we had that incredible ceremony in Moscow, where we saw, of course, Putin joining hands on stage with the 4 men appointed to lead the annexed regions, Zaporizhia, of course, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson. And so Kherson was meant to be the symbol of this region that had now become part of Russia forevermore. And of course, what we're seeing now is that Kherson is now, it looks very likely will become in Ukraine occupied territory, restored to Ukrainian borders, at least in an active sense. And not only that, of course, that one of the men who was having that ceremony with Putin and joining hands with him and chanting and singing was the Kherson chief that we spoke about yesterday, who it looks like, and we don't know yet, has been assassinated by partisan activity. So this is a really, really significant moment. And to Roland's point, I think, however people try and spin this, and not only Putin's propagandists, but also there have been a lot of prominent military hawks on Russian Telegram who have been trying to sell this as a necessary and important strategic maneuver. Indeed, I saw one who was comparing it to the retreat by General Kutuzov, abandoning Moscow in 1812 for the sake of preserving his army against Napoleon. I mean, this kind of way of selling it, however much one seeks to do so, the symbolic sense, I think, isn't lost on anybody, and this is a humiliation really for the Russian state. But it's significant in another symbolic way too, and that is that the international community is watching this, and at a critical moment, another pivotal moment, just as we saw with the counteroffensive many months ago, there are a lot of questions being asked, as there have been recently, about what the future trajectory of the war is looking like. Is it going to be a stalemate? Are the Ukrainians going to be able to continue that push and that sense of momentum which will keep Europe unified and the Western world unified in its support of Ukraine as we enter the critical months of winter? As I've spoken about this week already at length, there were questions being asked about whether Ukraine can actually continue to be successful, and there were concerns, particularly in Washington, that certain partners were wobbly. To put it mildly. And so this, once again, Ukraine have been able to show that the momentum is with them. And not only that, as we enter this crucial period, that there's going to be substantial military activity. Again, to Roland's point, this is going to take many weeks for Russia to retreat. There's something about 20 to 30,000 Russian troops in Kherson, that you can't just remove those in 2 or 3 days. So we now know that for at least the next few weeks and months, that Kherson is going to be being talked about. It's going to show that the military map is evolving and changing. That winter stalemate that many feared and that was being used as a weapon to justify potential peace plans is now being eroded away, and many politicians will no doubt be talking about the fact that it is now looking more again likely that Ukraine are able to launch and successfully deliver substantial military successes. So I think, as I say, there's the strategic side of this, which we've already talked about, but the symbolic one is as important, I think, and one that no doubt is not being lost to the Ukrainians and Western politicians.
Thank you for that, Francis. My next question, to what extent do you think the retreat might be an attempt at deception by luring Ukrainian soldiers into the city and blindsiding them with an attack?
Well, I think, was it Volodymyr Zelensky said last night, the enemy does not give us gifts. And I think he's absolutely right to be cautious. And is it Podolyak as well made this comment about believe it when you see it? I mean, that is absolutely 100% my rule of thumb when dealing with announcements by the Russian government. It really is a question of believe it when you see it, and there is a big difference between an announcement and a fact on the ground. Now, that said, I think this probably is going to happen because I think, as I said earlier, I think the basic nub of the report that the Russian commander in Ukraine gave Sergei Shoigu in this televised, stage-managed televised meeting is basically true. I mean, it's a fact. It is basically long-term untenable. So my gut feeling is it is going to be a retreat. They are going to do this, and the reason they've publicized it is to get ahead of the narrative. They want to show that they're in control and they can spin it as a Dunkirk or something, or Kutuzov's retreat from Moscow or something like that, rather than that utter disaster in Kharkiv back in September where they were just routed and it was a complete collapse. Now, that said, we know about Russian retreats. We know quite a lot about Russian retreats now, given the past few months. And one of the things they do when they are pulling back is they booby trap absolutely everything. Wagner in particular have a reputation for this. We saw it in their retreat from around Tripoli in Libya back in was it 2019 or 2020. You will have hand grenades tied to beehives, children's toys, any building you go into. It's going to be absolute. Literally a minefield, right? So, the Ukrainians moving into villages that the Russians have quote unquote abandoned will have to go extremely carefully, kind of assuming that every single rock or every door handle you touch might blow up in your face. That's absolutely true. And the other point, which I think Mikhailo Podolyak made, is also that, look, the Dnieper there, it's not at its widest, right? It's not miles wide. I think it's about 500 meters across. It's well within range of artillery. So even if the Ukrainians do get into Kherson, it is well within range of Russian artillery from the other bank. And I cannot see the Russians wanting to do this without extracting as much cost from the Ukrainians as possible. So in short, I don't think this whole announcement is one big feint and a Mascarovka, to use that much maligned and overused Russian term. I think it is most likely a genuine retreat. They will try to have nasty surprises in there. But the other question, the bigger question, is what happens elsewhere on the front once the Russians have pulled back. This front line is going to be pretty static because putting a landing either side crossing that river is going to be a very tall order. So we'll expect combat to move, maneuver combat to move eastwards. I'm particularly thinking about Zaporizhia region, but then also, our old friends of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv in the coming months. And of course, if you're retreating, one thing you want to do is to distract your enemy. So it's possible you might see a spoiling offensive by the Russians to distract the Ukrainians to help them carry out this retreat, this extraction from Kherson more easily.
Thank you, Roland. Francis, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add to Roland's?
Just one thing I would add, which is I think that Roland was talking about the broader strategic significance of Kherson, and it's been quite an interesting briefing put out by the UK Ministry of Defence this morning, saying that, or really underlining the fact that the loss of Kherson's West Bank will likely prevent Russia from achieving its strategic aspiration of a land bridge reaching Odessa. So we're talking rightly and focusing on the symbolic and strategic significance of the city, but it's also wider than that. It's going to have huge ramifications for the wider front, and indeed, of course, long term will be significant about any attempt by Ukraine to take back Crimea. Now, that is, of course, something I think that we're many, many months away from. But nonetheless, this is an important staging post for any attempt to do so. Holding Kherson is a vital strategic thing. And I think just the other thing that's worth talking about, to Roland's point and what we've been talking about this week, is that essentially the Russians are retreating in order to build a more effective defensive line. They've already moved their headquarters to the other side of the river some time ago. That was a pretty wise decision, really, given the rate of the advance of the Ukrainian troops. And we've talked at length this week about the kind of defences that are being built there. And I think that, we're going to see that if they are going to try and take that territory in due course, the Ukrainians, it's going to be a really, really bloody struggle. It's going to be much more tactically difficult to take that land, I think, with the kind of defensive operations that the Russians are doing. That's not to say they won't succeed, but I'm saying that it's bloody, as we were talking about yesterday. So a really very, very significant development on lots of fronts.
Thank you for that, Francis. Another question, anybody feel free to jump in on. We've spoken about the symbolism of Kherson and how this retreat looks symbolically. How will this affect Russian morale on the front lines and beyond?
It's never good. It's never a good feeling retreating, and any general, any military profession, any army you talk to will talk about it. It's a rule. It's almost like a rule of physics. When you're retreating, morale is a problem. It goes down, and the art of retreat is to manage that, to stop it getting into a rout, to stop, to kind of persuade people. Okay, it's not a nice feeling, but we've got to do it, and you've got to maintain your discipline. And doing it under fire is immensely difficult, especially when you've got to cross a river or to get out at sea. And there are multiple examples through history. I'm sure Francis can pick some out of his head of that going horrendously wrong. We in this country are incredibly proud of one episode where we pulled that off, which was Dunkirk. And one of the reasons that was spun into a myth was, partly it's the same reason Russians are going to try and spin this. It was a setback, it was a retreat, it was a defeat. I mean, it was a disaster, and it had to be spun. But there is also a fact that pulling that off, that retreat from Dunkirk, was a remarkable achievement. So the Russians are setting themselves up for, or they've already set themselves up, haven't they? They're just kind of recognizing reality for an incredibly difficult military task, pulling this off. I would not underestimate them. I know they have really, really badly screwed up this war, but they're still in the fight. There's still a lot of them. They still have some effective, highly motivated units. And I think, the Ukrainians are quite right not to underestimate their enemy. But I would guess, for those guys in the trenches, in that very flat farmland in the southern steppe where there isn't much cover, now knowing that you've got to get back across that river, you've got to get back across one of those very, very narrow bridges which are going to be covered by Ukrainian artillery and HIMARS fire, it is not going to be a good feeling at all. Not very comfortable.
Joe, I believe you have some thoughts on another defeat for Putin. Please do tell us more.
So one of the big victories for Vladimir Putin in taking Kherson was essentially it guaranteed a fresh water supply to Crimea. So Roland will probably be able to go through the history of this more because he covered it more extensively at the time. But in 2014, when Moscow illegally annexed Crimea, Kyiv responded by essentially erecting a dam to block the North Crimean Canal, and that supplies Crimea with about 80% of its water. And one of the big things, and Russia was very quick to do this, it was about, I think, 2 or 3 days into the invasion, it destroyed that dam and allowed basically water to flow back into Crimea and to guarantee a supply of fresh water. So now, with kind of Ukraine becoming further in control of this supply of fresh water again, they could rebuild the dam, reblock water. And essentially what this does is it eats away at this kind of aura that Putin and Russia have built up around Crimea being this kind of fortified stronghold where Russia is able to give it the best of everything, kind of have the best security, have the best beaches, the best water supply. And without a great deal of Kherson, and with Ukraine back in control of that water supply, it kind of erodes Crimea as a massive Russian kind of stronghold. And again, the further Ukraine can move towards the peninsula, the more kind of military bases, the more ammo dumps, the more planes and helicopters will be in the range of Ukrainian HIMARS fire, which is about 50 miles. And I think Rob Lee on Twitter was yesterday highlighting just how far and much further that the Ukraine's military can kind of penetrate inside of Crimea by just moving into Kherson city itself. So I think that's the water is a fascinating thing, and it's potentially one way that Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukraine can again look to put a stranglehold on Crimea if it does ultimately opt to go for and try and liberate that after the 2014 annexation.
Thank you, Joe. One for you, Roland, and perhaps, Joe, you could also weigh in. For how long are they, and by they I mean the military and the Russian state media, going to be able to sell this retreat as a heroic and difficult decision? A withdrawal from the front line seems like such an obvious defeat. Will the Russian people really buy it, and for how long?
Will they buy it? I mean, I think the Russian spin doctors in the Kremlin have been quite sensible about this, because they're not trying to sell this as anything other than a setback. You just had to watch the kind of, the funereal kind of atmosphere on Sobolev Live, one of the main kind of hawkish talk shows on Russian TV last night. Kind of, look, let's not pretend that this is anything other than bad news. But and then come the excuses. We're fighting NATO. We're fighting 50% of the global economy, which is delivering war. And when we went to war with NATO, our nuclear deterrent would protect us, but it turns out we're fighting a different war than was planned for. And so there we are. And they're trying their best not to be left looking like they're selling a lie, and yet trying to tell people, look. It's just one of those painful things. War gives you nasty surprises, and it's got to be done. And there's very deep, cultural historic memory that they can draw on for that. Russians have made, this government in particular has made an enormous national myth out of the Second World War, and everybody knows that the first part of that went incredibly badly for the Russians. Napoleon's invasion in 1812, that other thing they love to talk about. Moscow was burnt to the ground. Kutuzov had to retreat. So painful retreats and coming back from it is something I think that the Russian public have a capacity to digest and internalize. However, how many of these can you absorb after Kiev, after Kharkiv, now after Kherson? What happens next? And I think when you talk to Ukrainian officials, and this is the big gap, I think, which maybe we should touch on, the big gap in perception, I think, between a lot of Western officials and diplomats and and Ukrainians in Kiev is that a lot of Westerners or Western governments seem to have this idea still that, look, eventually this war is going to end in talks, and somebody's going to have to sit down and talk to Putin and find something that we all agree on. The view in Kiev seems to be, no, guys, this is going to end with regime change in Russia when this scale of this military battlefield defeat, this continuous succession of setbacks and humiliations and disasters finally comes home to roost in Moscow, and the whole rotten system over there collapses. So I think there is a perception in Kiev that is probably where the end game of this war. So for now, I don't think this is a mortal blow to Russian public morale necessarily, but it's cumulative. It's definitely cumulative, and when the history comes to be written about how this war ends, if it does end that way, people will talk about when they finally had to retreat from Kherson as one of those elements.
Staying on the military theme, Francis, I understand there's been some interesting analysis from the US in the past 24 hours. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, thanks, Claire. And actually, just riffing off what Roland was saying there, I think he's absolutely right to talk about that disconnect amongst some Western political and military figures and the Ukrainians. Indeed, there's actually been a very interesting one in the last 24 hours. So US Army General Mark Milley, he has made some quite interesting remarks, I think it's fair to say. To Roland's point, he's talked about how Russia's retreat from Kherson and a potential stalemate in fighting over the winter could provide both countries with an opportunity to negotiate peace. Now, as I say, he is the US's top general. What we don't know is the degree to which he's going off script here. There's a bit of a sense that he might well be. I don't think this aligns with the White House's view, not at least officially, but I think it is indicative and at least symbolic of a trend in thinking that is, as I say, not unpopular, although I do think there has been a shift, certainly in tone in recent days, as it's becoming increasingly clear that the Ukrainians were being successful in Kherson and the Russians were being forced to retreat there, as I was talking about earlier on. So there has been quite a backlash to this, but his remarks are, and I'll read a quote directly, he said, "There is an opportunity here, a window of opportunity for negotiation. For negotiations to have a chance, both Russia and Ukraine would have to reach a mutual recognition that a victory is maybe not achievable through military means, and therefore you need to turn to other means." Now, as I say, not necessarily representative of the White House's view and the American public view, but nonetheless, that's his personal opinion. The other interesting thing that he talked about is he said that well over 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the war in Ukraine. But he also said the same thing probably on the Ukrainian side. There has been a tremendous amount of suffering, human suffering. And he then went on to estimate that around 40,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or wounded. Now, again, I don't think this would necessarily be seen as official figures that are coming out of the US, but if that is true, those are, of course, very, very high figures for the Russians that would broadly tally with what we've talked about so far in our coverage in recent months. But it would be higher than we would expect for the Ukrainians. Typically, when you're on the defensive, then you are able to lose fewer men, essentially, than if you're on offensive operations. So this has caused a little bit of surprise. But as I say, I don't think it should necessarily be seen as an official remark. It feels a little bit more off the cuff than that. But nonetheless, I think it's causing a little bit of frustration amongst Ukrainian commentators who feel a bit that, again, it's sounding a little bit like both sides are losing, both sides need to come to a negotiating table. Whereas, of course, from the Ukrainian perspective, they would say they've lost fewer men, certainly fewer resources, and that they are winning the war. As simple as that. So that's the US general story. And just one other, if I may. I've talked already this week about about this ongoing saga around the G20 summit in Indonesia and whether Putin and Zelensky will attend. Well, we now know that Putin will not attend the G20 summit in Bali next week. That's come from an Indonesian government official who's told that to Reuters. He will, however, be represented by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and another official in charge of coordinating maritime and investment affairs. Now, Putin may attend one of the meetings virtually. Now, if he does so, Zelensky has said that he will not take part in the summit. So it's still an ongoing debate, this, about exactly what's going to happen. But interesting that Putin is not going to attend, presumably because pressure has been put on him, and also he doesn't want to face embarrassment of being cold-shouldered by international politicians and diplomats. Just one other remark on this is it's quite interesting that Indonesia itself has resisted pressure from Western countries and Ukraine to withdraw Putin's invitation by saying that it actually doesn't have the authority to do so without the consensus among members. And I think that's probably true, actually, that they are hosting it, but they are not actually able to dictate the terms of who attends because it's up to the G20. So another interesting development there in the political space that I just thought it was worth providing an update on because, as I say, potentially quite significant.
Thank you, Francis. Following on from what you were saying about Mark Milley, sort of making claims about the 100,000 troops killed on either side, as well as 40,000 Ukraine civilians, I understand there's an update on the future of US supplies to Ukraine, in that the US has said they won't give advanced drones to avoid escalation. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, this is another interesting development in the space that we were alluding to earlier on. There's still concerns around giving Russia an opportunity to escalate things further, an excuse to do so. And indeed, the US have given Ukraine already very advanced weaponry, of course, the HIMARS most significantly. But there's an advanced kind of drone that they are saying that they will not give Ukraine. This is formally from the Biden administration, saying that they've declined the request based on concerns that providing the Grey Eagle MC-1C drones could escalate the conflict and signal to Moscow that the US was providing weapons that could target the positions inside Russia. So they essentially don't want to give weapons that could, I'm not saying that Kyiv would do this, but that could, would be advanced enough to launch very, very distant strikes on Russian territory itself. And US officials, as I say, are concerned that this would provide Russia with an excuse in which to conduct perhaps some kind of escalation. Now, I think, as you can imagine, again, this has caused some anger because people say, well, if Russia is going to do some kind of escalation, as they've already done in recent weeks, indeed committing war crimes on their attacks on civilian infrastructure, then they are going to do so. They don't need excuses. So why do you need to be thinking in those terms? But nonetheless, that's what the Biden administration have said. But I think if we're taking the long-term view here, as depressing as that may sound to some listeners, and I imagine that many in Ukraine are thinking, why on earth can't they give us these weapons if Kyiv are pleading for these? I think we just need to look back to how far things have moved and inched forward in recent months. When the war began, there was concerns about even sending tank support. You remember the Germans only sent 5,000 helmets initially, and there was a lot of consternation about that. But that was a genuine fear, amongst European powers, that giving anything other than defensive provisions would be seen as very dangerous. Now look where we are. Very, very advanced weaponry in the hands of the Ukrainians. There's even now conversations about giving them more fighter jets, which was, of course, something that was very much considered a red line issue when the war began. So there really has been an advancement in this space. And I think that, again, it's happened in a gradual way, and it's quite hard to track that. But if one was to think back, as I say, many weeks and months, then you can see that things are moving forward in this space. And who knows, maybe within another few months, these kind of drones will be provided to Kyiv. But it has to happen at the right pace, or at least that's what the Biden administration would say.
Yeah, and I just kind of mention the fact there's still not kind of space in Ukraine to effectively fly these drones. Both sides have relatively effective air defences, and they cost quite a lot of money. And where you can kind of mitigate the risk of using a HIMARS, because they can fire from 50 kilometers or 50 miles behind the lines and move away very quickly. Flying these drones and they can fly for kind of 12 to 24 hours at a medium altitude. They're still at risk from being shot down. And I think is the US and the UK and other countries that have these higher tech drones and other pieces of equipment that they've resisted sending to Ukraine actually been because they're worried about them landing up in Russian hands. So there was reports earlier this week that alongside a big shipment of nearly 200 million euros in cash to Iran, Russia sent a Javelin and an NLAW launcher, anti-tank launcher, and essentially what the Iranians are very good at is reverse engineering Western tech. So are these Western military powers, the UK, the US, France, whoever, actually more concerned about losing their hardware into the hands of Russia? I remember I was on the aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, days after an F-35 fighter jet had gone off the side. And I was speaking to an American general who had been put in charge of the salvage operation. He was very much of the mind, look, this is an American fighter jet. It might be in British hands. It might have been given to the Brits, but it's our technology. We've created it alongside a host of other countries. We will be getting this jet back before any Russian, Chinese, and there was even talk of the Turkish military looking to try and cash in by capturing and finding this jet first to basically look at the technology because they've been closed out of the F-35 program. So I think that's probably more of the concern on this front, is not that escalatory issues come into play, actually, because they're more worried about there isn't a safe space to fly these drones yet, and they could be falling into Russian hands very easily within hours, within days of them landing in Ukraine if they're not used sensibly.
I am aware that we are coming towards the end of our episode, so Roland, if I could come to you first, what are your final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes, well, if you open the paper tomorrow, you will see, this dispatch that Joe is working on, along with some other colleagues, about, voices from the ground in Kherson. The other thing I hope you will see is a thing looking at this diplomatic issue, this push for talks that Francis alludes to. Mike Milley's comments, and there's also an interesting piece citing US officials on NBC today, talking about them, saying, we don't think either side can win. Maybe the winter slowdown is an opportunity for talks. We're making calls, and currently the impression is that kind of allies are aware of these moves or these talks. They're not quite sure what it means. But again, just to underline, my impression from my conversations with people in Kiev is that there is this basic disconnect. There is an assumption that, okay, this war can't be won by military means. There's going to be talks in the West, and in Kiev they think, no, you don't understand. Like, we're going to win on the battlefield, and that is going to collapse Putin's regime. I think, and okay, that is as so often when you're spitting things out off the top of your head. That's a bit of a caricature, but that's the basic gap in perceptions, and that, I think, is one side's right. Obviously, we don't know which one. That's the thing that has to be bridged, I suppose, in one way. But keep a lookout for that. That's what we're going to be focusing on tomorrow.
Over to you next, Joe. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I just want to step away from the military side of this conflict and go into the humanitarian issue. And there is increasing parts of Ukraine that are now without electricity, without gas, without running water, and it's starting to get colder now. So we're kind of starting the days off in almost in sub-zero conditions, and it's probably getting up to 2 or 3, maybe 5 degrees if you're lucky in certain areas. But there are still vast amounts of the country that are without kind of the basic needs to survive, and that's kind of heating and electricity to keep warm. And we often look at what sort of assistance as Western governments we can give in terms of whether it be missiles, whether it be drones or other things. But maybe we just need to be looking at and asking Ukrainian charities what we can do for them in terms of, is it electric heaters, which are slightly futile in a lot of situations because many cities are without power for 5 or 6 or 7 hours a day, sometimes more. Can we send more generators? Is it even simple things like blankets and warmer coats that we can look at supplying to charities to distribute people that? And so I've spent a lot of my trip in Ukraine has been visiting sites that were once kind of headline news because they had literally immediately been struck by a Russian missile or a Russian shell. But then we visited them a month or two after this kind of devastating attack, and people are still living in the ruins of these houses without windows. So can we potentially help by sending contractors out or construction materials out to help people rebuild their houses before winter does become very crippling? So kind of January, February, March will probably be some of the coldest months that Ukraine will have. And I just feel that we're running up to the point where it's a humanitarian crisis kind of on the verge of happening. And we're maybe looking too much militarily at the conflict when we should be looking at how we can help Ukrainians on the ground survive the harsh winter coming. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joe. Over to you, Francis, for your final thoughts.
Thanks, Claire. And I would just echo Joe's sentiments there. I think he's absolutely right about the oncoming potential humanitarian tragedy. And I think that's something that we'll certainly try and talk about more in due course on the podcast. I just wanted to end by looking at a story from about 5 or 6 days ago that has been published by the Kremlin. And it's about Putin's meeting with some historians and representatives of Russia's traditional religions. And it's really interesting when we've talked about culture so much on this podcast to look at the remarks being made by Putin in quite a relaxed fashion. This is not really as much of a formal speech, I think. So we get perhaps an insight into the kind of messaging that he's putting out and perhaps some of his more inner thoughts on these cultural and historical issues. So as part of these conversations that he had, and it's quite a long collection of remarks, and so I'm sort of summarising them here. But the first thing he does is talk a lot about history, and it's quite remarkable what he says. He says it's unacceptable to repeat the mistakes of the Soviet period, when scholars' conclusions were often adjusted to preset templates. Something similar is happening now in some countries in the West, where much is determined by today's radical liberal agenda. It is known that if someone wants to deprive a state of sovereignty and turn its citizens into vassals, they begin by rewriting the history of the country, depriving people of their roots and condemning them to oblivion. Well, I mean, it's very striking reading that because I think it's pretty indicative of what Putin in many ways has tried to do within Russia. His analysis may be correct, but he's doing it to his own people. I mean, I've been very struck in recent years following what's been happening in Russia and looking at history textbooks, for instance. It's been the repatriation of Stalin, a man who committed millions of crimes against his own people, murdered millions of them, and yet is now being taught as if he didn't kill that number. Memorial, of course, one of the Nobel Prize winners, was silenced and forced to close. Indeed, there's even a textbook in Russia that talks about it not being a Nazi-Soviet pact, but a Nazi sort of allies pact, with Britain and other countries. So real direct distortions of history. So that's quite remarkable. The other couple of things that I thought was worth drawing attention to in his remarks is this idea of Western insemination of false consciousness amongst the Ukrainians. A really remarkable quote this. He said, in Ukraine, the West has managed to instill in the minds of millions of people the pseudo-values that led to the fact that they created an anti-Russia on this territory, sowing hatred, raping people's consciousness, depriving them of their true history. their true history. Everything was done to reshape the consciousness of millions, and they very skillfully tried to light the fuse to cause the fall of our country. So this idea that what's happening in Ukraine is in some way not in any way a conscious act of the Ukrainians, but rather is a manipulation by them of the West. As if there is only one true Ukrainian history, and it is one that aligns that country with Russia and its sense of a continual lineage where those two countries are one. Again, very much a distortion, and one that many Ukrainians, of course, would repudiate, but fascinating. And last but not least, he talks about justifying the war in Ukraine as an offensive for defensive reasons. So he talks about how the West essentially has been breeding hate towards Russians and Russia, and that it's been doing it for decades, and that it was necessary to launch the war in Ukraine now in order to prevent worse happening later. And indeed, he talks about 1941 and the mistakes that were made in terms of ignoring the warnings about a potential Nazi invasion and not striking, and thus saying that actually, by implication, that the war in Ukraine was preventative in some way to stop another version of 1941 and some kind of Western invasion, if indeed that's what he's alluding to. So, as I say, quite a long final thought, but it's quite a chunky subject, this, but I just thought very, very interesting and perhaps concerning remarks there by Putin that gives an insight into his philosophy.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly and ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell and Emily Hill.